So often on this channel we're looking at types of medieval and Renaissance armour, a really popular topic, and doesn't everybody love a knight in armour? But of course there were far more people wearing armour than just knights and cavalry in the medieval period. And there are many types of armour that some of you might not have heard of, and today we're going to be looking at one known as jack chains. Did you know about jack chains? Post down below. I want to know before I do this video whether you've heard of them or not. But jack chains are very, very popular in the modern reenactment and living history world. So they're really popular with modern recreationalists. But when you actually go and look at the period sources, you're like, where are all the jack chains? So what we're going to look at here is, what are jack chains and did they actually exist in the medieval period? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and I'm just going to dispense with this lovely breastplate, which incidentally is from Artos Munitorum. Big shout out to them. Thank you again for donating this to the channel. Very, very kind. And as you well know, things that do get donated to the channel usually feature in videos across the course of years, as is the case with that breastplate. And something else which wasn't actually donated, was actually bought by me, is a brigandine. Now, why am I showing you a breastplate and a brigandine? Well, because to remind you, I recently did a video opening up the question of why is it that in some countries, for example, England, France, Spain, Italy, we find loads of brigandines in the 15th and 16th century, very common type of common soldier's defence. Whereas when we go to, let's say, Switzerland and what's now Germany, so the states which later unified into Germany, we find that they usually wear breastplates and cuirasses instead of brigandines. And that's one of the great questions of armour studies, is why that should be the case. And we've got a slightly similar issue here with the issue of jack chains. So quite simply, what are jack chains? They are supposedly chains sewn or otherwise attached down the outside arms of something like a gambeson or a jack. In other words, they're chains added to a jack, hence jack chains. And the idea, the basic kind of, if you ask an average reenactor who perhaps wears these, what are those all about? They'll say, well, these are jack chains, and people who couldn't afford more extravagant armours, such as a brigandine or a breastplate, if they just have a jack or a soft armour, a gambeson, something made out of fabric, then a cheap and affordable way of them augmenting the defences of the arms is to add chains, or so-called jack chains, which can be made of plates. I'll go into that in a second. So in other words, adding plates down the arms gives a hard reinforcement, and that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? We can see this in modern sporting equipment, where sometimes, even in HEMA, where sometimes we add on certain bits of rigid defence, which protects the bones from being broken, because of course, although the jack or the gambeson or a mail shirt would prevent a cut, it doesn't necessarily prevent the impact. And if someone's swinging something like a poleaxe at you, smack, even if it doesn't go through the gambeson, it's very likely that it's going to break your arm. Okay, so having hard splints along the bones makes an awful lot of sense. So they're really popular with reenactors doing the 15th and sometimes 16th centuries in the modern world. And they make perfect sense. They're a relatively cheap and easy to make. I mean, you or I could make them fairly easily with the right tools. A cheap way to augment a padded defence or fabric defence. So it makes sense. Reenactors use them a lot now. So they must have been common, right? Well, here's the problem. So over the years, many people have asked me to make videos about jack chains, and I kind of stayed away from the topic because I have this sneaking suspicion that they didn't really exist, or at least didn't exist very much. Now, I know at some point some of my friends who study armour are going, yes, Matt, haven't you looked at Hans Memling? We'll come to that in a second. Haven't you looked at X, Y and Z, the reliquary of St. Ursula and these various other medieval sources which seem to show them? But before I get into those, I'm going to caveat that. So one of the problems when we're looking at medieval art, and I've talked about this in previous videos, is very often medieval art isn't simply documenting contemporary life. It's very often showing scenes from the Bible, adventures of Alexander the Great, King Arthur and his knights, Lancelot defeating the, these are mythology of the time. So very often when we see, and even when they're showing bits of history like the Crusades, 300 years earlier, they show their kind of fantasy idea of the Saracens. Here comes the Saracen in his full plate harness with lots of gold bits and wings on his helmet and a big curved scimitar. So very often in medieval art, they're not necessarily showing a real thing. They might be showing within what's their frame, you know, their kind of reference point of what's conceivable, but they're deliberately often showing something weird and wonderful. So this is the problem. When we find something in medieval art, but it's incredibly uncommon, we don't necessarily know that it's a real thing. It might just be dreamt up by the artist. So look, what do we actually see in medieval art? Well, the first thing we have to say before we say what we do see is what we don't see. We don't see lots of jack chains. We see all sorts of other things. We do see absolutely loads of gambesons and jacks in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. We see loads of brigandines. We see loads of mail shirts. We indeed see loads of breastplates, as well as the brigandines. And of course, we see plate defences for the arms, sometimes worn obviously by the soldiers who are better equipped. And sometimes they're not worn. Okay, so we see all of the usual things that we talk about on this channel, but we don't see many jack chains. However, we do see some. So on the screen at the moment, I'm going to be showing a few examples that are, you know, relatively easy to find. There might be more obscure ones out there, but these are the examples. If you just Google anything to do with jack chains, or you go into My Armory or Facebook or whatever, and there's a discussion about jack chains, these are the pictures that will normally come up as showing jack chains. But here we encounter yet another problem, because some of these examples, as I've mentioned, might be showing biblical or mythological or legendary scenes, number one. But secondly, in some cases, what is labelled as jack chains aren't even necessarily jack chains. So it's very clear that some of the examples we see aren't actually jack chains. For a start, they're not chains. I'll come back to that in a second. But secondly, something we absolutely know existed in the 14th, 15th and 16th century is reinforced clothing. Okay, so one of the things they sometimes did is they took a strip of mail, and it just so happened I have one to hand here. So a strip of mail like this, and this might be an offcut of, you know, resizing a mail shirt or a skirt to go with plate armor or whatever, and you end up with this strip of mail and you think, well, that's really useful. Much like me, I put this aside because that is useful. And then they go, well, you know what, you've got an arming doublet, or you've got a you know, a travelling doublet, or kind of gambeson or something. So let's stitch a line of mail down the arm, and that'd be really good. That will make it even more resistant. And we know that was a thing. Equally, we sometimes see it on the legs, even on hose. So mail was sometimes stitched onto clothing or light fabric armour. But in addition to that, sometimes plates were sewn inside or underneath. We know that was a thing. I mean, that's fundamentally what a gambeson is, or a coat of plates. But in addition to that, we also know that sometimes it wasn't metallic at all, and sometimes what we see in art is actually leather or stiffened fabric, and it's an attachment point for plate armour to go over the top. So sometimes in the art, what you see is someone with a coulter or elbow piece, and then you see strips above and below. But we don't know what those strips are made of, and we know that some arming doublets have leather strips above and below here, which the arming points which you attach to the plate armour, so the vambraces and the rear brace, attach to that. So they're reinforcements to the fabric to stop the fabric from tearing. They're not necessarily reinforcements against weapon strikes. So it all gets really complicated. Now, I mentioned about not all of the jack chains necessarily being chains, and in fact, if we look at medieval art and we start really trying to find examples of jack chains, what we often find actually are minimalistic plate arm defences. So arm defences, if we ignore the shoulder, are essentially made of rear brace, coulter and vambrace. Okay, so lower arm, elbow and upper arm. And in some cases, particularly in the sort of, let's call it the German lands, or German-ish lands, we sometimes find that the plate of the forearm and the upper arm can be quite narrow and quite minimalistic. Does this qualify as jack chains? Personally, I'd say no. I'd just say it's a lightened, minimalistic version of a normal arm plate armour. But then again, if we class those as jack chains, well, then if we go back to the 14th century or early 15th century, we find similarly, sometimes we find splint, elbow, splint Is that jack chains? And the problem is here is also, therefore, defining what qualifies as jack chains. Is it just a minimal arm plate armour? Well, maybe, maybe not. So I've relied a lot on art so far. Now we go into the written text, and the problem is the written texts do occasionally mention things like jack chains, which might be exactly like we are talking about jack chains being, and might be exactly what reenactors recreate. Or they might be something else, and we don't always know, and that's the problem. When a written source describes something, we don't always know exactly what they mean. They just use their name for the thing. And here's the other problem with the whole concept of jack chains from my point of view. Lots of different types of armour existed and were abundant. So obviously mail, okay, like this mail skirt here of mine, but mail shirts have been around for centuries. I mean, going back to the Roman era. And so there had been a big accumulation and build-up of mail in medieval Europe. Mail wasn't particularly rare. So when we see common soldiers, whether they're Swiss pikemen or whether they're English archers or whatever, French crossbowmen, very often they're wearing a mixture of armour, sometimes brigandines, sometimes breastplates or cuirasses, very often mail shirts, and that's what they normally wear. And they don't normally need anything like jack chains, and if they do have armour, they tend to just have normal plate arm defences. Nothing like a jack chain, really. So in essence, if mail is plentiful and basic cheap plate arm defences are available, why would you even bother with jack chains? So let's answer the question, did jack chains exist? Well, I think that we have enough things like jack chains, even if most of them aren't actually chains, they're a series of plates, in medieval art, particularly 15th and 16th century German art. Okay, so we're talking about late 15th century, usually between 1450 and 1500, or between 1500 and 1550. So this kind of window between 1450, 1500, and it's almost all, as far as I've seen, from Germany. I can't think of any examples from English art, French art, or even Italian art. They all seem to be from the German or sort of German-speaking lands. Okay, so did they exist? I think we have to say they probably existed because they are in some art. Were they common? No, I don't think they were. I don't think jack chains were ever common across medieval Europe. And if they were slightly popular anywhere, it was only in the German lands. And I think the way we need to look at them is, yes, they were probably something that were experimented with some people, but mail, really good, well-made jacks and gambesons, or indeed plate arm defences, were common enough and available enough and affordable enough that for the most part, if you were a soldier that wanted extra arm defences, you'd just use one of those instead of jack chains. So there's my answer. Now, I might revise, as with everything, as I gain more knowledge. Sometimes in the comments you might point out other examples to me, or bits of written text or whatever. I might revise this view in the future, but my current view of jack chains is, did they exist? Probably. Were they ever common? No, and I think they probably weren't worn at all in some parts of Europe. And there's basically other things available which are better and were widely available. Anyway, do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you know any other new bits of evidence? And are there any other questions you have about related or contemporary bits of armour? Because I love talking about armour, as you might have guessed. Anyway, I have been Matt Easton. I will continue to be, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.